Hey everyone. As Professor Sunita mentioned, I'm Robert Searles from the University of Delaware, and I'll be talking today about abstractions and directives for adapting wavefront algorithms to future architectures. So just some background motivation for our work. Parallel programming is the future. The government spends hundreds of millions of dollars building supercomputers like Summit, pictured on my slide, which means that we have to take advantage of all the acceleration that these particular types of machines can offer with things like GPUs and other heterogeneous architectures. Currently, existing state-of-the-art abstractions handle a lot of simple parallel patterns well. So the typical case, you'll see people give you a matrix multiply example or things of that sort that are relatively straightforward, or some basic recursion, master-worker tasking, these types of things that are already well-researched. But complex parallel patterns such as wavefront, what I'm going to talk about today, can prove to be more of a challenge. So the contributions of our work are I'm going to be presenting an abstract representation for wavefront algorithms, a performance portable proof of concept of our abstraction using OpenACC on a real-world production code used by Oak Ridge National Lab, and an evaluation of that proof of concept on multiple state-of-the-art platforms, and a description of the limitations of existing high-level programming models and how we can overcome these limitations. So just some general background for people who might not be as familiar with heterogeneous systems. There's several ways to accelerate your applications using these types of systems. There are libraries which provide drop-in acceleration, so you can call out to if you've ever used a deep learning framework like TensorFlow, or if you've used any linear algebra solvers like cuBLAS. You sort of feed it in some data, tell it what algorithm you want run on your data, and then it will run that on whatever hardware is available, whether that be a GPU or another type of multi-core system. There are programming languages, so I'm sure everyone has heard of CUDA from NVIDIA, which is a pretty low-level language, but it provides a lot of functionality and flexibility. You can directly interface with your hardware. You can tell your code exactly what you want it to do and when you want it to do it. And then there are directives, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. So basically, we're talking about an extension to an existing language, so you don't have to actually learn a new language or re-implement your code at all. You can just sort of annotate your existing C or Fortran code and tell it what your target architecture is, and the compiler will generate this code for you. So the two most common directive-based programming models are OpenMP and OpenACC. By a show of hands, how many people in the audience have used either one of these before? Oh, okay, almost everyone, good. So OpenMP is a multi-platform shared multiprocessing API that since 2013 has started to support device offloading for heterogeneous systems. And OpenACC, since its inception, was a directive-based model for heterogeneous computing. So I did have a little example just in case we had anyone who wasn't familiar with this kind of programming model, but it seems like everyone is. So just real quick, if we had a very basic loop like shown on the slide, and we wanted to run this on our GPU using OpenACC instead, we would add a directive, and it would tell the compiler we would like to run this in parallel on our GPU. And if we were to do this in CUDA, it would look something like this, because we'd have to do all of our memory allocation, all of our memory movement, launching the kernel, all these things verbosely and explicitly. So as I mentioned before, these models already handle simple parallel patterns pretty well. So we saw that for loop that I showed. It's relatively simple. There's no data dependencies. It's an embarrassingly parallel loop that is very trivial for the compiler to generate GPU code for. But that's not typically what you see in production codes. When you actually move from synthetic benchmarks into production codes, you see more complex behavior, data dependencies, potentially different threads trying to write to the same location in memory. That can require either manual code rewrites or additional functionality. It's not as trivial to implement these types of things, so we need additional features and extensions. A large portion of our work is how do we actually identify that, and then how do we move forward into actually creating these additional features and abstractions that we can integrate into these models. So as I mentioned, I was going to talk about a case study application that is used by Oak Ridge National Labs called Minisweep. So Minisweep is it's a mini app that basically represents the main sweep kernel of the Denovo radiation transport code, which is used to model nuclear fusion reactors. So, and specifically, it has been used to model the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER. The goal is basically, the way that the domain scientists use this application is they run it many times with different parameters. The faster it runs, the more configurations they can explore in a fixed wall time. It poses a multi-dimensional problem, 3-dimensional in space, 2-dimensional in angular particle direction, and 1-dimensional in particle energy. So this isn't as simple as a single loop nest that we need to parallelize. There's a lot of different things that goes into this particular application, and we want to be able to run it as fast as possible so that we can explore as many configurations as possible. The code status, when we originally started talking to Oak Ridge and working with Oak Ridge on this, is available on Wayne's GitHub. It was selected for early application readiness on Titan when Titan was being built, and it is currently being used for the acceptance testing of Summit, which is the #1 top 500 machine that was just built at Oak Ridge. To give you an idea of what that machine looks like, it has about 4,600 nodes, and each of them have 6 NVIDIA Volta GPUs in them. This code originally was ported to Beacon and Titan, which are Oak Ridge machines, using OpenMP and CUDA respectively. And basically, since these machines keep changing and they keep building a new one every so often, Oak Ridge wanted a more portable solution for something that they use so much, which is why we originally started investigating implementing this code in OpenACC. All right, so the basics of Minisweep. How does it work? I mentioned before that I was going to be talking about wavefront codes, and Minisweep is a wavefront code. So what a wavefront code looks like is something like shown in this video, where we have a diagonal iteration over a multidimensional space that involves some data dependencies, which is why we iterate over the space that way. You saw the blue wave sort of propagate through the cube. Everything in blue can be computed in parallel at any given wavefront iteration step, but it relies on upstream data in order to perform that computation. So we have a complex data dependency here where we have some parallelism, but we can't just simply parallelize all 3 of our dimensions without any concern. There are some dependencies that need to be taken into consideration. So more specifically, the way it works in Minisweep, outlined by this figure, is if we were starting in our top left corner with our yellow cube, every cube that's being computed, we call them grid cells, every grid cell that's being computed by Minisweep relies on its upstream neighbors exactly 1 space behind. So that can be up to 3 grid cells per grid cell being computed. So in this case, we would compute our yellow grid cell first, then we'd move on to the 3 green grid cells, and they would rely on the data computed by the result of the yellow grid cell, and so on and so forth, with the blue grid cells would rely on the green grid cells, et cetera, and we'd propagate through our 3-dimensional space this way. So this is what I'm talking about when I refer to a wavefront. And just to kind of give you a clear picture of how this would work, this is a 2-dimensional example, but every node here of a given number can be computed in parallel. So node 1 would be computed first, and then both the nodes that are marked 2 rely on the information from node 1, but they don't have any data dependencies across each other, so they can be computed in parallel, so on and so forth. So that's how we get this sort of diagonal behavior of a wavefront code. And Minisweep is a little more complex because we have a 3-dimensional space that we're exploring. So we have X, Y, Z dimensions, and then I have energy groups and angles here, which basically are the components of the in-grid cell computation. So at each one of these grid cells, we're not computing one thing; we're computing a collection of things. So there's a collection of particles in each unit of space, and we have to do some computation on each one of those. So when we approach this problem, we see basically, at a high level, 5 nested loops, and I know that I'm going to be using OpenACC for this particular work. And OpenACC currently, the PGI's implementation only really offers 2 levels of parallelism, gang and vector. the worker clause is not working properly, and I can explain that to you later if you, offline, if you want to know exactly what was happening. It's a little complicated, but I do have a bug report submitted with them, and it will be fixed. But for all intents and purposes, when we were doing this work, we could really only rely on the gang and vector clauses. And like I mentioned earlier, there is an upstream data dependency in our spatial dimensions. So then I started thinking about, okay, how are we going to map this to a GPU, right? This is a diagram of, I believe this is a GTX 1080 from NVIDIA, of what a GPU looks like. And basically what I wanted to highlight is we have 2 layers of parallelism that are exposed to us with OpenACC. So the first is the gang level. So what I have circled in red here is an SM, which stands for streaming multiprocessor, which is your GPU is laid out into a number of SMs, each with a number of cores inside of them that you can think of as vector threads. So when you're using OpenACC and you say, hey, I want to parallelize something at the gang level, it's going to actually split that particular loop into blocks, which are going to run across SMs, and then your vector computation that would happen inside of each gang would then be parallelized across the cores within one of those SMs. So back to the wavefront algorithm, how do we actually map this to our particular algorithm that we're talking about today? So this has been sort of an ongoing issue since the 90s, parallelizing these types of sweep algorithms. And the accepted solution is something called the KBA method, which is an acronym referring to Koch-Becker and Al-Kuf, who actually developed the algorithm in 1992 at Los Alamos National Lab and published a paper on it that talked about parallelizing a sweep algorithm that overcomes the data dependencies using a wavefront. So doing this sort of diagonal iteration and parallelizing along each one of those wavefront iterations. But all the existing solutions out there right now involve some kind of manual code transformations. And this is the kind of thing that we want to get away from, because as these parallel patterns get more and more complex, that's going to require more manual rewrites and more intervention from the programmer. And you're not really going to have a truly portable solution if for every new architecture that comes out, you still have to be messing around with restructuring your loop nest in such a way that you can map to that particular hardware. There are polyhedral frameworks in existence that support these kinds of, support automating these kinds of transformations, such as Chill Framework and Pluto. But they have some limitations. They only support affine loop transformations. You have to know not only what your fixed loop bounds are that can't change, but there can't be any sort of aliasing going on or anything like that in order for their compiler to handle this properly. And they are experimental, and you would have to implement sort of within the scope of that framework. There is currently no solution in any widely used high-level languages like OpenMP or OpenACC for wavefront type codes. So we would like to change that, since this type of data dependency does occur in a wide range of scientific applications, not just limited to radiation transport codes. So we want, as I mentioned, we want to create an abstraction for this wavefront pattern. So we need to do a couple things in order to do that. We need to analyze the flow of data and computation in wavefront codes. We need to think about the memory and threading challenges associated with those data and computational dependencies. And then we need to come up with a way to actually automate the transformation of these loops. So when I initially looked at this code, it looked something like this, which is relatively straightforward, where we're iterating across all 3 of our spatial dimensions, and then we have our energy and angle in-grid cell computations that happen within each unit of space. And unfortunately, what I ended up having to do was actually completely transforming the outer 3 dimensions of this loop nest to iterate over a number of wavefronts. The number of wavefronts can be calculated as a function of the size of the 3 dimensions, parallelizing over 2 of those dimensions, and then solving for my 3rd dimension, at which point I check to make sure that I'm actually at a grid cell lying along that wavefront in order to perform computation. And that allowed me to parallelize this in a high-level manner. I put that in air quotes because it still was kind of complicated and required some code transformation. as I mentioned, there is no existing abstraction for this. So what we're focusing on is the parallelization of the spatial decomposition. The in-grid cell computations do not have data dependencies. So within a given grid cell, you have an embarrassingly parallel computation. This is simple. I do have a note here that they are application specific. So we have this notion of particles and directions of those particles in Minisweep because of the nature of the simulation being run. But wavefront codes in other domains can have completely different in-grid cell computations and a varying amount of it as well. So we want to focus on these upstream data dependencies in the spatial dimension. And I have a note here that there's a slight variation between wavefront applications because in our particular case, we're only looking at our immediately preceding neighbors, but that might not be the case for all wavefront codes. Specifically, the Smith-Waterman gene sequencing algorithm looks farther upstream than Minisweep would. So this is something we need to consider as well. So that leads us to thinking about a data model. So for Minisweep, we don't necessarily need to store all previous wavefronts because we only need the one immediately preceding neighbor to any given grid cell being computed along a wavefront. So in theory, you could limit your data structure that you're storing these in to be the size of the largest wavefront, which would be when you hit the middle of the cube, when the wavefront is the largest. That would be optimal, but not practical, because now you're introducing a layer of computation in regards to, based on where I am, how do I compute the correct value to grab the neighbor that I need, and I now have this one-dimensional array that's not of the same size of any of my dimensions, and it can get a little bit confusing. So we used something that we called face arrays, which are basically a flattened two-dimensional array in each upstream direction. So we have 3 of them. And basically what I can say is, okay, if I need the neighbor to x minus 1, y minus 1, I would just access that face array at x minus 1, y minus 1. So we're storing a little more data than we need, but it makes our indexing really easy and doesn't add any additional computational overhead. And you can think of that as in each upstream direction for any given grid cell, you would have a two-dimensional plane that's sort of flattened across each end of this cube that we talked about earlier. So some limitations of existing programming models. Like I said, there's no abstraction for wavefront loop transformation, so I had to do some manual loop restructuring here, and I had limited layers of parallelism, so 2 isn't enough. My worker clause is broken, so I only have gang and vector, and I have asynchronous execution noted here because Minisweep doesn't actually run one sweep, it runs 8. So what it does is it actually runs one sweep starting at every single corner of the 3-dimensional space that we're exploring. Those sweeps are also parallelizable, but how do we do that if our programming model only actually gives us 2 layers of parallelism? So my preliminary solution to that is to asynchronously launch kernels, to use asynchronous parallel regions in OpenACC. But it would be nice if we had a more elegant way to do that. So I'm going to show you some results from my experiments. We used a variety of different machines because we wanted to demonstrate a portable solution. So we used NVIDIA's Professional Services Group cluster, which has a number of different kinds of nodes. Specifically, the ones that I used had Tesla P100 and V100 GPUs. And for legacy purposes, I tested on their K40 nodes as well for backwards compatibility. I also ran on Oak Ridge's Titan supercomputer, which has AMD CPUs and NVIDIA K20X GPUs. And I ran on Summit Dev, which was the development cluster that's supposed to be representative of what Summit now looks like. At the time, Summit wasn't built yet. So it has IBM Power 8 processors, NVIDIA P100 GPUs, and there are 4 GPUs per node in that particular machine. And the same goes for a PSG cluster as well, 4 GPUs per node. We're using PGI's compiler 17.10, which was the community edition at the time. The current community edition is actually 18.4 that they released in April. And we used for OpenMP, we used GCC 6.2 because that's what Oak Ridge was using to compile their OpenMP 3.1 implementation. I did have some issues running that on Titan, but it worked okay on PSG, so I have some results for that. My input parameters, so the size of my simulation, my XYZ dimensions are set at 64. There are 64 energy groups and 32 angular directions for each energy group. The reason that I chose those sizes is because that is representative of what I was told would be run at Oak Ridge. So they said basically 64 energy groups and 32 angles per energy group are about as big as the simulation is going to get in terms of in-grid cell computation. But they want to be able to blow up the spatial dimension as big as possible to either model a bigger space or to get some finer granularity within a fixed space. So I have some preliminary results here. So a couple things to note about the performance of our results here. First of all of these clusters of histograms are sorted by machine, and they're titled by the GPU in the machine. They are normalized within each given machine, and those machines don't have the same CPU. So that sometimes can be a point of confusion. It's worth noting that, so we did run our OpenACC version on multi-core CPUs as well to prove that it is portable and gets comparable performance to OpenMP. But we also ran on the rightmost bars on each cluster are our GPU runs. And it's worth noting that we are pretty neck and neck with CUDA on all of the machines. And actually on the P100, V100, we were a little bit faster than CUDA when running on a single node. I also included this yellow and light blue bar here, which shows us the same, still using OpenACC versus CUDA, where we're still getting comparable performance, but we're actually not parallelizing the spatial dimension at all. So we're not using that KBA method that I talked about earlier, and instead we're just parallelizing in-grid cell computations there. The reason I wanted to include that was to show there's a giant gap between these runs and these runs as it relates to adding that spatial component in to further motivate why this is so important. We're leaving a lot of performance on the table if we're just taking the easy way out and only parallelizing our in-grid cell computation. And there's not enough in-grid cell computation to actually harness the full power of our GPU and to saturate it as far as computationally speaking. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to talk about an abstract representation of wavefront algorithms. So we know what a wavefront algorithm is, what it looks like, how to identify one, a performance portable proof of concept of this abstraction using OpenACC, evaluation on multiple state-of-the-art platforms. So we saw results not just on Titan and K40 nodes, but also on P100 and V100 nodes. V100s are the GPUs that are in Summit, so that is sort of the current state-of-the-art. And a description of the limitations of existing high-level programming models. So where to go from here, I mentioned earlier, I'm already using asynchronous execution, but I would like to investigate what sort of implications using something like MPI for multi-node and multi-GPU would have. So as I mentioned earlier, we're storing for each wavefront, we're storing the results of the previous wavefront. Well, what if one grid cell being computed on one particular node needs information from a different node that's contained on a different node? What kind of overhead am I looking at there when whether I'm using halos or doing some kind of synchronization at each step? And I want to prototype this extension to sort of automate this wavefront loop transformation thing that I discussed earlier. I do actually have some preliminary results since we submitted here for the MPI portion. So as I mentioned earlier, over serial we're getting about a 66x speed up, one node, one GPU. When I scale that out to 4 nodes and 4 P100 GPUs on PSG, that number jumps up quite a bit. It's about 8.5 times faster than using a single GPU, and we were using 16 GPUs total. So there is some overhead here. This is a memory-bound application, so there is some overhead as it relates to what I suspected in regards to, if data transfer between nodes and dependency satisfaction between nodes. And I also ran it on the V100 nodes on PSG. The P100 and V100 nodes on the PSG cluster have the same CPU. So these speedo numbers are directly comparable, and we get a bit of a boost just from using V100 since they have more cores. And also, it's also worth noting that distributing the workload lets us examine larger spatial dimensions. So I want to also investigate using blocking for this and try to figure out how to do that while minimizing my host-to-device transfer. And the reason I say that is because currently the way Minisweep is set up, if you can't explore more spatial dimension than you can fit on your GPU within GPU memory. So we would like to not have that limitation in the code and explore how we can do that using blocking, but also not incur a huge data movement cost. And then just some general takeaways from my experience doing this. Using directives is not always magical. There's not a directive for everything, even though we would like there to be. But compilers are doing a lot for us already. Our code benefited from incremental improvement, profiling and reprofiling. So the first thing I did was I tackled the easy part, which was our in-grid cell computations. And that's sort of when I realized, hey, there's an additional layer of parallelism to be had here, albeit not trivial. And watch out for bugs and report them. I reported several. I think I reported like 3 or 4 bugs to PGI throughout this whole process. The programmer is not always wrong, although we are usually wrong. And just to watch out for novel language extensions and propose them to committee. There is an OpenACC users group forum. They are really responsive. They want to know if you find this type of stuff in your code, how they can make the model better. Things to ask yourself while you're programming. Did you completely change your loop structure? Did you notice a parallel pattern that we don't have a high-level directive for yet? Or do you feel like even though you're using a directive-based model, you're doing a lot of code modifications still? These are the kind of things that programming model people want to solve, and the reason that these abstractions exist. So that's it. I have my contact here. You can email me, and all my code's available on GitHub if you want to check it out, and I'll take any questions.
Questions for Robbie? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. So I may have missed something about the abstraction, but is it my understanding that you are running the same code on OpenMP and on CPU and on GPU? And so do you think you really have it's completely performance portable and you could not get better performance on CPU? Or it's contradicting with what was presented on Monday about the performance portability with OpenACC. So what's your feeling with your code? You are pretty confident that this is really
so I actually think that we have a little more performance to be had on the CPU side. And the reason I say that is because the default behavior of OpenACC when you compile for CPU target instead of a GPU target is it's going to take whatever you have marked as gang level parallelism and parallelize that. The reason that matters is because our outer layer of parallelism, the gang level, is our actual wavefront iterations, which are limited by data dependency. So in the case of using a multi-core CPU, I don't actually have enough cores I have enough cores that I could parallelize just my in-grid cell computations and actually probably get a better speed up, which is what, back on my results, my clicker's not working, but back on my results slide, you saw in a couple cases the OpenMP version was outperforming the multi-core OpenACC version, and that's due to the fact that it was parallelizing a different component of the code. This is another thing that I've reported to PGI because there's supposed to be a way in OpenACC to say, hey, parallelize my vector loops if I'm compiling, based on what target architecture I'm compiling for, I want to parallelize different loop nests, portions of the loop nest, and that currently is not implemented in the PGI version. So that is something that I would really like them to do, because currently it is not the best CPU implementation. I'm confident that this is the best GPU implementation that we can do of the code, but not the best CPU implementation. But it is worth noting that it does still run on CPU and still is better than running a serial version.